attack in London. Britain's Prime Minister condemns an evil ideology. We'll get the latest in live reports from London, and we'll discuss what it means for the U.S. with Roy Blunt, a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Then, President Trump pulls the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord and starts a global debate.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
We'll discuss the impact on the environment, the U.S. economy, and America's place in the world with Scott Pruitt, head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And critics attack President Trump for leaving the climate deal, pointing to long-lasting consequences.
Make our planet great again.
How is he ever going to explain to his grandchildren what he did to the air they breathe?
We'll talk with one of the world's leading advocates on climate change, former Vice President Al Gore, who calls the president's withdrawal reckless and indefensible. Pruitt and Gore, live only on Fox News Sunday. Plus, former FBI Director James Comey testifies before Congress this week about his conversations with Mr. Trump. We'll ask our Sunday panel about what promises to be a moment of high drama. All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. We begin with breaking news out of London. At least 7 are dead and dozens injured after another terror attack targeted Britain's capital. This comes less than 2 weeks after a suicide bomber hit a pop concert in Manchester, England. In a few minutes, we'll talk with Senator Roy Blunt, a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. But we begin with Fox team coverage. Catherine Herridge on what the intelligence community is saying. But first, senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palcott, live from our London bureau. Greg.
Chris, for the third time in 3 months, terror hits the UK. And once again, it is ugly. It was on a busy Saturday night in London that the attackers spread across London Bridge in a rented van, driving up on the walkway, smashing into pedestrians. They then ditched that vehicle a few blocks away and, armed with long knives, stabbed their way through bars and restaurants nearby, with some putting up a fight. All told, at least 7 people were killed, 48 injured, many critically, including an off-duty police officer, along with British citizens from France, Australia, and elsewhere were targeted. No word yet on whether any Americans were involved. Now, police caught up with the attackers just 8 minutes later, shooting dead all 3. At least one had a beard, camouflage pants, and a fake suicide vest. When one attacked, he reportedly screamed out, "Praise to Allah," the Arabic word for God. Here is what UK Prime Minister Theresa May had to say today.
As a country, our response must be as it has always been when we have been confronted by violence. We must come together, we must pull together, and united, we will take on and defeat our enemies.
Police now say they have arrested 12 people following raids in eastern London, said to be the home of one of the attackers. It is a sign that authorities might be on the trail of jihadis. Police also doing a thorough forensic search of the entire terror site. But what is next? Prime Minister Theresa May also said today, terror breeds terror. Chris.
Greg Palcott reporting from London. Greg, thanks for that. Now let's bring in Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge with the latest on who was behind the attack. Catherine.
Chris, no group is claiming responsibility this morning, but within minutes of the attack, a senior ISIS-affiliated social media account pushed out slick propaganda on using vehicles as weapons, threatening more violence. It's not clear whether the ISIS posts were opportunistic or the terror group played a role. This morning, U.S. and U.K. intelligence are focused on the suspects and whether they acted alone or had a terror network behind them. British security sources reporting that very early indications suggest the attack may have been pulled together at short notice. With the rising homegrown threat, British police are trained to quickly neutralize suspects, as they did last night.
That vehicle continued to drive from London Bridge to Borough Market. The suspects then left the vehicle, and a number of people were stabbed. The suspects were shot dead by armed officers.
Homeland Security is saying that at this time they have no information to indicate a specific credible threat to the United States. But Secretary Kelly told Fox last night he worries we are, quote, right around the corner from having a similar attack, but for the efforts of DHS and law enforcement agencies. President Trump was briefed last night and spoke with the British Prime Minister, expressing his condolences and praising the heroic response of London police and first responders. The president also seeming to make a political point that the attack bolstered his travel ban. "We need to be smart, vigilant, and tough," he tweeted. "We need the courts to give us back our rights. We need the travel ban as an extra level of safety." Questions are being raised this morning about a possible intelligence failure after the British government recently lowered the threat level, Chris.
Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Joining me now, Roy Blunt, a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
What can you add to what we just heard from Catherine Herridge?
Well, you know, I think what we're seeing here is just such a broad band of potential attacks. You know, we hear from our own intelligence community and have for years now more threats from more directions than ever before. You see the terrible Manchester bombing, those young people, mostly young women, young girls, with a fairly sophisticated bomb based on published reports on that. These guys have a van and kitchen knives. We think other groups are looking at more advanced kinds of attacks, and so clearly this is from all directions. ISIS tends to take credit for the things that you can steal a truck, get your van, drive in a car, terrorize people with very little planning or backup. Other groups, we believe, are looking at other things, and we are constantly have to be vigilant. And I think Secretary Kelly is right when he says that only because we have been fortunate and worked hard to prevent this have we not had these kind of attacks here.
I want to play a clip from British Prime Minister May today. Here it is.
While the recent attacks are not connected by common networks, they are connected in one important sense. They are bound together by the single evil ideology of Islamist extremism.
Any explanation as to why we have now seen 3 fatal terror attacks in Britain in less than 3 months?
I don't know if there's any real explanation for that, but in Paris, in London, in Western Europe generally, you've got people who came there to do jobs that were allowed to stay in enclaves, never became part of the society. You see the second generation of those families often turning to what the Prime Minister mentioned. You know, we need to say it. We need to talk about it. Our friends who are Muslim need to admit that this extreme sense of Islam that results in these attacks has to be called for what it is, and we have to try to do what we can to intervene.
Do we have, I've heard the argument that because we're beginning to roll back ISIS in the so-called caliphate in Iraq, in Syria, that there's an increased emphasis on attacks, these kind of low technology attacks in the West. Do you think our success in one place is creating more of a threat?
I think it can. And, you know, somebody made the observation not long ago that sometimes countries implode. Syria seems to have exploded. That as things change in Syria, people have access to Europe in ways that you would otherwise want to try to do something about. There's no way to do background checks on people that come in from communities that no longer exist, jobs that were jobs months or years ago. And so I think we do see that. And, you know, like so many of the things that have happened in Northern Africa, what people initially thought would be the result turned out to be just the opposite.
As a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, any indication of an increased terror threat here in the U.S.?
I think the terror threat is real. You know, one of the things when we've seen things like San Bernardino, more often than not, U.S. officials, the FBI and others talk to these people after months of surveillance, decided that they no longer needed to be under the level of watch they were, and then suddenly these kinds of things happen. I do think, again, that you've got some groups that are looking at a big play like taking down an airliner. You've got others who need very little support, very little planning, and can do incredible damage, which is actually, in many ways, almost more of a terrorism, because you go anywhere, do anything, you wonder what could happen at any moment. It could happen
London
here.
Bridge on a Saturday night.
London Bridge, the Westminster Bridge, the concert,
yeah.
all of these things are true terror targets. They're not. It's not like going after the U.S. Embassy.
Right.
They are true terror targets.
As Catherine mentioned, just after the news broke about this terror attack, President Trump tweeted another call for his travel ban. That case is now before the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you think the justices should pay attention to the kind of thing that is happening in England and other parts of the world as they make that decision? I mean, the fact is, in Britain, most of these terrorists have been homegrown. They've been UK citizens.
They have been, and you know, looking at where people like that who are coming to our country have been is important. I'm not nearly as concerned as a lot of people are about the visa waiver program, because the visa waiver program just triggers that you can spend more time on people who you have reason to believe may have been in Libya, may have been in Syria, may have become radicalized. I don't know what the court will decide. I'm not a lawyer. I think my view is the president does have certainly the right to put in place extreme vetting. You know, Chris, it's been 4 months since they said they needed 4 months to put that in place. I think you can do that without a travel ban, and hopefully we are.
I want to talk to you about another hat as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. A lot of anticipation about the testimony this week from former FBI Director James Comey. What do you expect to hear from him? What questions do you have for him?
Well, I think it's important that we talk to everybody that should be talked to about this. I do believe that the Senate Intelligence Committee is the most likely place to bring this investigation to conclusion, with whatever the conclusion turns out to be. You know, used to dealing with each other on issues like this, so we're used to classified documents, we're used to coming together to protect the country. Hopefully that's what we'll be able to do.
What are you looking for from Comey?
What Comey says and how he says it, I think, will be important. I haven't, frankly, understood much of what Comey has done since about a year ago. And his decisions have been, I think, highly questionable. We'll see why he was prepared for that meeting the way he was. Said he had a round of murder board kind of questions before he went to see the president, why he thought it was important to immediately download that, and what other meetings he had that, frankly, he didn't think were so important to download what happened.
Finally, do you think that President Trump has a legitimate claim to executive privilege to block Comey from testifying? And as a practical matter, do you think he should invoke it?
I think the president is better served by getting all this information out sooner rather than later. Let's find out what happened and bring this to a conclusion. You don't do that, I think, by invoking executive privilege on a conversation you had apparently with nobody else in the room. You know, most stories have two sides to them. At some point, we'll hear the president's side, but I frankly think we need to hear Mr. Comey's side and find out what other questions we need to ask after he answers the questions this week.
Senator Blunt, thank you. Thanks for your time this Sunday, and thank you for coming in on short notice.
Glad to be here.
Up next, President Trump's dramatic decision this week to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. We'll talk with EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, a key player in the president's deliberations. A look outside the Beltway at Pittsburgh. The president said he's looking out for residents of the former steel town in pulling out of the Paris climate deal. International leaders, business executives, and people around the world are still reacting to President Trump's decision this week. In a few minutes, we'll talk with former Vice President Al Gore, a leading advocate on climate change. But joining me now is Scott Pruitt, Mr. Trump's administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency and a key player in the president's decision. Mr. Pruitt, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Good morning, Chris.
I want to start with a question that you were asked repeatedly on Friday. Here it is.
Yes or no, does the president believe that climate change is real and a threat to the United States?
Does the president believe today that climate change is a hoax?
What's interesting about all the discussions we had through the last several weeks have been focused on one singular issue, Is Paris good or not for this country?
Let me get this straight. You and the president spent weeks discussing whether he should pull out of the Paris climate deal, and you never discussed climate change?
It was about the merits and demerits of the deal, Chris.
But
so
part of
that's
that is
absolutely the
climate
focus. That's
change.
absolutely the focus. Look, when you look at what this country has achieved since the late 1990s, 2000 time frame, we've seen an 18% reduction in our CO2 footprint from 2000 to 2014. We're at pre-1994 levels. You know, what's interesting about all this criticism from the left, the environmental left, is if you go back to the time that the Paris deal was cut, those same groups, in fact, James Hansen, former national scientist, called it a fake and a fraud. The general counsel of the Sierra Club was critical of what was achieved in Paris because it didn't hold China, it did not hold India accountable, and the United States agreed to 26 to 28% reductions in its GHG. But that's been the focus.
Sir, we're going to get into all of that, but what I'm asking you is, as the president's EPA administrator, as his point person on the environment, isn't that a conversation that over the last few months you have to have, whether or not climate change is real or a hoax, as the president suggested, and whether or not human activity contributes to it? Are you saying you've never had that conversation with it?
The focus of the last several weeks
over the last few months
was centered on the merits and demerits of the Paris Agreement.
Have you ever had a conversation on climate change?
The president has said actually back during the campaign that climate change occurs. I said during my confirmation process that climate change is occurring, that human activity contributes to it.
He's also said it was a hoax.
Well, Chris, the point here, and to your question, this is something over the last several weeks. The president has received much information about the impact on jobs and also the impact on the environment. You know, we have nothing to be apologetic about as a country with respect to what we've done in reducing our CO2 footprint.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but you're not going to tell me whether or not the president believes climate change is a hoax and whether or not human activity. It's a simple question.
The president has indicated that climate changes. It's always changing. I've indicated the same.
Well, that's just saying
what's important, Chris, here, what's important is what the president did on Thursday was put America first and say to the United States and say to the world that we're going to remain engaged, but we're also going to make sure that as we remain engaged, we put America's interests first.
As you pointed out, the president justified pulling out of the Paris deal largely on economic terms. Here he is.
The American family will suffer the consequences in the form of lost jobs and a very diminished quality of life.
But the study that the president cited was funded by two groups that are dramatically opposed to environmental regulation, and the study itself acknowledges it does, this is a quote from the study, it does not take into account potential benefits from avoided emissions. The study results are not a benefit-cost analysis of climate change.
Well, there were several.
Administrator, it is a worst-case scenario.
There's several studies that were actually published in response to Paris. NERA, the Heritage Study, the Global Policy Publication.
He specifically quoted NERA.
There were several that were sourced aspects as far as his speech. And what we know from the Paris Agreement, objectively, is that it was a $2.5 trillion contraction to our economy over 10 years. What we do know is it impacted up to 400,000 jobs in this country. What we do know is it impacted both the manufacturing base and energy sector jobs. You know, since the fourth quarter of 2016, Chris, we've had almost 50,000 jobs created in the mining and coal sector alone. In fact, in the month of May, almost 7,000 jobs. So these individuals that are saying, and I think what's also being missed here is that when you look at how we generate electricity in this country, the power grid, we need fuel diversity. We need coal, natural gas, hydro, renewables, nuclear as part of that mix because it provides stability and strength to our grid and lower costs. Our price per kilowatt compared to Germany, our price per kilowatt compared to Europe is far better, and it helps us grow jobs in this country.
But Mr. Pruitt, aren't you focusing on the wrong thing? I want to put up some, I must say, surprising statistics. Take a look at this. The U.S. now employs more than double the number of people in the solar industry that it does in coal. Aren't you and the president talking about protecting the horse and buggy business just as cars come online?
Absolutely not, because as I just indicated, we need coal, we need solid hydrocarbons stored on site at utility companies across this country to address something, a tax on our grid, a tax on infrastructure. If we have peak demand needs, you want a diversity of fuels that generate electricity. It is bad business. It is bad business for a country to limit the amount.
The president talks about protecting the people of Pittsburgh. The mayor of Pittsburgh said, we're not a steel town anymore. We're a green town. And in fact, he rejected what the president said. And the mayor of Pittsburgh, the city he specifically cited, said, we're going to comply with the Paris Climate Accord.
This president has said we truly need an all-of-the-above approach. We should not penalize sectors of our economy, Chris. Government regulation shouldn't be used to pick winners and losers. The past administration declared a war on coal. And there were several coal facilities across this country shut down because of their past efforts. That is not what government regulation should be about. Government regulation should be about making things regular, not picking winners and losers, and making sure we have fuel diversity in generating electricity in this country. And as I indicated, the jobs numbers show already that this president's deregulatory agenda, his leadership in the energy space, is making a difference for jobs across this country. Almost 50,000 in the coal sector alone.
Another issue, because the president also said that the Paris Climate Accord and pulling out of it isn't going to make all that much difference on the environment. Here he is.
With total compliance from all nations, it is estimated it would only produce a 0.2 of 1 degree. Think of that. This much.
But the people behind the MIT study, that study that he just cited, say that he took a number from 2014 before the targets for the Paris Accord were even reached. And the co-founder of the program said this about the White House. They found a number that made the point they want to make. It's kind of a debate trick. The people behind the study the president cited say, look, Paris isn't going to solve everything. It isn't going to solve global warming, but it makes an important contribution.
What short memories these folks have. What short memories they have. James Hansen, former NASA scientist, the father of climate change, he's been called Paris a fake and a fraud because of the very things the president cited. 0.2 of 1. There are other studies. The Global Policy publication came out criticizing.
Are you going to speak to what the MIT author said?
It's very fishy to me that the MIT updated their study or their results after we started citing it. No one's questioned the methodology.
Well,
nobody's questioned
the findings. You didn't cite their study after Paris. You cited their study before Paris in 2014.
And what's interesting, Chris, is during the time before Paris, this country reduced their CO2 footprint by over 18% from 2000 to 2014. What does that demonstrate? It demonstrates that American innovation, American technology is leading the way with respect to reducing the CO2 footprint, not government mandate. If China and India want to reduce their CO2 footprint, they should learn from us.
Well,
India, by the way, in the Paris Agreement, talking about the merits of the deal, Chris, conditioned any steps that they would take on receiving $2.5 trillion of aid. China agreed to take no steps until the year 2030.
But wait.
They're the largest polluters in the world.
Let me pick up on that because you've taken me exactly where I wanted to go.
Well,
because the president, yes, this is working together. The president had one more big complaint about Paris, and he said that it treats the U.S. unfairly.
China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants. So we can't build the plants, but they can, according to this agreement. India will be allowed to double its coal production by 2020.
But here again, sir, the reality is different. It's very different from what the president said. China has canceled plans for more than 100 coal plants and promises 20% of its energy consumption will be green by 2030. India has pledged 40% of its energy will be renewable by 2030 and is set to pass Japan this year as the world's third largest market for solar power. So it may not mandate it in the Paris Agreement, but in fact China and India are going green already.
You know, what's interesting, one of the key words that was up on the screen was plants. China was actually building over 360 new coal generation facilities and had 800 planned, Chris. So maybe they've drawn back on the number that are planned, but they're burning coal, and they're going to continue to burn coal.
Well, we're burning
for the foreseeable future. We've had a contraction with respect to our grid quite substantially. We used to be well above 40%. We're now down around 30%, if not less. So this country has front-loaded its cost. The rest of the world said, hey, we'll get to that later. They applauded when we joined Paris. The rest of the world applauded, not because of climate reductions, but because it put this country at an economic disadvantage. The Clean Power Plan alone represented almost $300 billion of compliance cost to our economy. So why wouldn't why wouldn't France and these other countries want us to stay in that kind of deal? It's a bad deal for this country. The president didn't say, by the way, that we weren't going to continue engagement. The president didn't. He said Paris represents a bad deal for this country. He also said we're going to renegotiate, and all of the leaders around the world, certainly in Europe, said forget it. Well, then he also said either a new deal or as part of the Paris Agreement. But we're already look, we're the United States, Chris. We don't lose our seat at the table. We joined a treaty in 1992 called the UNFCCC with respect to climate change, right. and that is still there. We're going to remain engaged internationally, but we're going to make sure that as we make deals, that we put the interest of America first. This was applauded by small business. You know, it was interesting. The New York Times yesterday had an article of small business that applauded.
I don't want you to filibuster so we can't get to Al Gore. We want to get to him too. And you've brought up a lot of legitimate points I'm going to ask him about. Mr. Pruitt, thank you for your time. Always good to talk with you, and thank you for answering our questions.
Thanks, Chris.
That's what it's all about. Up next, former Vice President Al Gore on Mr. Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Accord. Former Vice President Al Gore's breakthrough documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, brought the topic of climate change to the forefront. Not surprisingly, he is one of the sharpest critics of Mr. Trump's decision this week. We welcome him for what we believe is his first appearance on Fox News since the 2000 campaign. Mr. Vice President, good to have you back.
Great to be back, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to climate change, I want to ask you about this terrible attack in London. How do we stop these attacks on the West, and is President Trump's travel ban part of the answer?
Well, most of the attacks, both in England and here in the United States, have been by homegrown terrorists, and of course the courts will deal with the travel ban. They've already been struck down. We'll see what the Supreme Court does. This scourge of terrorism, we have to defeat it, but we have to defeat it not only with force of arms, but with the force of our values. And I truly believe that giving people around the world a sense that the world's got our act together and we're going to move forward to a bright future is one of the important tasks at hand.
Let's turn to the subject at hand. You met with President-elect Trump during the transition to discuss climate change, and afterwards you said this.
I had a lengthy and very productive session with the President-elect. It was a sincere search for areas of common ground.
You also talked with Mr. Trump, we're told, last month about staying in the Paris climate deal. Did you misjudge the president?
Well, I've kept my communications with him confidential. I think that's the right way to handle it, but none of it would surprise you. I did my best to persuade him it was in our country's best interest to stay in the Paris Agreement. I thought there was a chance that he would do that. I'm sorry that he made the other decision.
How do you explain it?
Well, you'd have to ask him for the explanation. It makes no sense to me. I think that it was a reckless decision, an indefensible decision. I think it undermines our nation's standing in the world and isolates us and threatens to harm humanity's ability to solve this crisis in time. But make no mistake about it, this country is going to continue to solve the climate crisis. Governors like Jerry Brown and Andrew Cuomo, Jay Inslee, many others, mayors, Mike Bloomberg's doing a great job rallying mayors around the country. We are going to continue reducing emissions. Atlanta just decided to go 100% renewable, and there are many, many others.
Let's talk, and you heard me challenge Scott Pruitt. I'm going to challenge you. Let's talk about some of the concerns that people have about Paris. President Trump talked about one.
It includes yet another scheme to redistribute wealth out of the United States through the so-called Green Climate Fund. Nice name.
Under the Paris Accord, 37 developed countries agreed to provide $100 billion to developing countries. Why is that fair?
Well, you know, when the Marshall Plan was launched by the United States after World War II, it ended up benefiting us tremendously, as well as making the world a better place. we would be 11th on the list of nations per capita in helping the country to meet this climate challenge. And by the way, one of the opportunities for us is to export our products and create more jobs here. You showed some jobs in the solar industry earlier. Solar jobs are now growing 17 times faster than other jobs. It's the brightest spot. If we get out there in the economy, if we get out there and help to lead this sustainability revolution, it benefits our economy.
But here's the problem I think a lot of people have. Countries like the U.S., which have been developing an industrial economy since the 19th century, the argument is that somehow we owe something to countries that didn't.
Well, it's a global challenge, and the world community as a whole has to face up to it. This administration has said there's no such thing as a global community. Actually, there is, because we, as a civilization, are putting 110 million tons of heat-trapping global warming pollution up into the sky every day as if it's an open sewer. You know, the climate crisis is real, Chris. I'm sure you know that. President Trump won't say whether he believes it's real or not, but it is real. And you don't have to rely on the virtually unanimous opinion of the scientific community anymore. Mother Nature is telling us. Every night on the TV news now is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. People are noticing this, these downpours and historic floods. We've had 11 once-in-a-thousand-year downpours in the U.S. just in the last 10 years. We've got these wildfires that become mega fires now. We've got 70% of Florida is in drought today. Missouri declared an emergency just a couple of days ago because of another one of these, and they keep on coming.
But let me pick up on that, because let's say that we agree, and you know a lot of people don't. Some people don't. Some people that watch Fox News don't. Even if you believe in greenhouse gas and climate change, there's some questions about how effective the Paris Accord is in dealing with it. Here's what EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt said on Friday about the effectiveness of the U.S. target, which is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 1/4 under 2005 levels. Here he is.
Paris, it set targets of 26 to 28%. With the entire agenda of the previous administration, we still fell 40% short of those targets. It was a failed deal to begin with.
You would agree that even if all 195 nations, now 194, met their targets, it still wouldn't solve the problem.
That is correct. However, it sends a very powerful signal to business and industry and civil society and countries around the world. And since the Paris Agreement was reached, look at what has happened. You talked about China earlier. China has now reduced its emissions 4 years in a row. It's reduced its coal burning 3 years in a row. India is now in the midst of a massive shift from coal to solar. Unbelievably, India just announced 2 weeks ago that within 13 years, 100% of their automobiles are going to have to be electric vehicles. We're seeing this in this country as well. I went to one of the most conservative Republican cities in America, Georgetown, Texas, in an oil state. They have just completed the transition to 100% renewable energy.
But that's part of the argument, Mr. Vice President, and it's a philosophical argument. Do you need government regulation, or will the economy, will the market work? And we took the case of solar, which is now double, pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we've got some stats here, so we'll do it. Greenhouse gas emissions already declined 12% below 2005 levels. Between 2004 and 2015, investment in clean energy rose from $10 billion to $56 billion, and as we point out now, twice as many jobs in solar as in coal. Isn't the country, isn't the world going green on its own? Does it need this government, this international regulation?
The answer is yes and yes. We're in the midst of a sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. But yes, we still need good policies because we have to move faster. We're in a race against time here. We're seeing very encouraging changes, but we have to change faster. The late economist Rudy Dornbush, I'm sure you knew him, he once said, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen much faster than you thought they could. And the Paris Agreement was a successful effort to send the signal, this train is leaving the station, everybody on board. The U.S. should be on board. States and cities and businesses and civil society leaders are on board. If we had the president on board and good policy, we could move even faster.
I fact-checked Mr. Pruitt. I'm going to fact-check you. Okay. After your movie An Inconvenient Truth came out in 2006, you made the following comments as part of your publicity for the movie. You said, unless we took, quote, drastic measures, the world would reach a point of no return within 10 years, and you called it a true planetary emergency. We're 11 years later.
Yeah.
Weren't you wrong?
Well, we have seen a decline in emissions for the on a global basis. For the first time, they've stabilized and started to decline. So some of the responses of the last 10 years have helped. But unfortunately and regrettably, a lot of serious damage has been done. Greenland, for example, is losing 1 cubic kilometer of ice every single day. I went down to Miami and saw fish from the ocean swimming in the streets on